One of the reasons I'm so nervous this afternoon is that I'm in awe of this lady, JoAnn Borovicka, from the first time I met her. She is a beautiful woman inside and out, very accomplished. She's an educational consultant, very creative lady. I love her slides. I always love her slides. So I know that you're going to enjoy this. JoAnn is the author of one of my favorite books about the Baha'i Faith. It's called Light of the Kingdom, Biblical Topics in the Baha'i Writings. And it's an introductory compilation of Baha'i teachings on biblical subject matter. It combines superb scholarship with remarkable brevity. That's two things that I love. I love brevity, so I'm going to stop very soon. But I just wanted to say, everybody, please welcome JoAnn. And afterwards, we'll have questions and answers.
Thank you. Okay, so parallels in the ministries of Tahirih and Paul. This is one of my favorite subjects. This is based on a paper of the same name that is published in Lights of Irfan, number 17, the book, and it's also freely available at Baha'iLibrary.com. So if this catches your interest, that's a paper that you can read. So, of course, Tahirih is an early believer in the Baha'i era, and Paul, an early believer in the Christian era. They are separated by 2,000 years and politics and all kinds of things. And yet, one of the things that caught my attention as I was studying both of their lives was these parallels that I saw between them. So we're actually going to be looking at 10 parallels in the ministries of Tahirih and Paul. So first of all, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Baha'i Faith, I'd just like to introduce some very important names. The Bab, which means the gate, is the founder of the Baha'i religion and the herald of Baha'u'llah, who is the founder of the Baha'i Faith. Now, the Baha'i religion is considered to be the earliest days of the Baha'i era, so they're very much connected. Baha'u'llah and Tahirih, whose actually given name at birth is Fatima Barakhani, they were both followers of the Bab. Fatima was given the title Tahirih, meaning the pure one, by Baha'u'llah when they were both Babis. So now I'm going to explore Tahirih first, and then we'll go to Paul. So Tahirih was the only woman among the Bab's original disciples, the group entitled the 18 Letters of the Living. So there were 17 men and one woman, Tahirih. She has a very high station in the Baha'i Faith. Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the faith, states that Tahirih is comparable in rank to those immortal heroines Sarah, Asiya, the Virgin Mary, Fatima, and Bahia Kanu. So Sarah being the wife of Abraham, Asiya being the wife of Baha'u'llah, the Virgin Mary being the wife of Baha'u'llah, Virgin Mary being the mother of Christ, and Fatima being the daughter of Muhammad, and Bahia Khanum, the sister of Abdul Baha, daughter of Baha'u'llah. So Tahirih has a very high spiritual station in the Baha'i Faith. Now, the Apostle Paul, originally named Paul, he's one of the most important figures in Christianity. 13 of the 27 books of Christian scripture that you find in the New Testament are attributed to Paul. And we'll look at that a little closer later on. This is a statue of Paul outside the Basilica in Rome. Of course, we don't know exactly what he looked like. In the Baha'i writings, Paul is honored by Abdul Baha and Baha'u'llah. Abdul Baha says that one's conduct must be like the conduct of Paul. And Baha'u'llah honors Paul by quoting some of his writings. in the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. And Abdu'l-Baha refers to him as Saint Paul, the great apostle. So these are both giant figures, Tahirih and Paul. Now, the first parallel we're going to look at is that both Tahirih and Paul are recognized for singular initiatives that contributed significantly to distinguishing the new revelation from the old. We'll look at Tahirih first. Abdu'l-Baha says that Tahirih was a burning brand of the love of God, a lamp of his bestowal. Now, of course, we don't have any photographs of Tahirih, so we don't know what she looks like either. This is an artist's rendition. Okay, so one of the functions of this lamp was to be the point from which some of the most challenging features of the early Baha'i era shone the brightest. Tahirih announced the advent of the Baha'i era at the Conference of Badasht. Now, the Conference of Badasht was a meeting of 81 leaders early in the Baha'i movement. One of the purposes of this meeting was to address the question of the Bab's precise claim. And that's because many understood the teachings of the Bab to be a reform movement within Islam, part of the Shaykhi school of the Shia sect of Islam. And of course, now we know that the Bab actually brought a new religion. And it takes a while for these things to be understood among the followers. So one of the purposes of this conference was to address the question of exactly what is the Bab's claim and mission. At the Conference of Badasht, Baha'u'llah, who was a follower of the Bab at this time, revealed a new tablet every day, gradually educating the Bab's followers on the distinctiveness of the Bab's new revelation. But it was through Tahirih's announcement, supported and protected by Baha'u'llah and Qudus, that the new dispensation's break with the past was unmistakably demonstrated. Shoghi Effendi states, it was owing to her initiative while participating in the Conference of Badasht that the most challenging implications of a revolutionary and as yet but dimly grasped dispensation were laid bare before her fellow disciples, and the new order permanently divorced from the laws and institutions of Islam. That's from Shoghi Effendi. Now, we often hear of Tahirih as a champion of the emancipation of women and as a poet. But here we see her function in the Baha'i era was much broader. Tahirih proclaimed the emancipation of the Bab's movement from Islam. So here Shoghi Effendi states that it was owing to her initiative that the implications of this revolutionary dispensation were laid bare before her fellow disciples, and the new order permanently divorced from the laws and institutions of Islam. I think that this is something that we can't minimize. This is a massive role. Let's look at this some more. Abdu'l-Baha states, Tahirih, with her face unveiled, stepped from her garden, advancing to the pavilion of Baha'u'llah, and as she came, she shouted aloud these words, the trump is sounded, the great trumpet is blown, the universal advent is now proclaimed. The believers gathered in that tent were panic struck, and each one asked himself, how can the law be abrogated? How is it that this woman stands here without her veil? Now, often we give attention to this as the beginning of the equality of women and men, which is one of the major principles in the Baha'i Faith, and that this was an early statement of this. But as described here by Abdu'l-Baha, it was also a statement of abrogation of the previous dispensation of Islam, an announcement of the new dispensation of the Baha'i religion and the beginning of the Baha'i era. Shoghi Effendi states, on that memorable day, the bugle mentioned in the Quran was sounded. The stunning trumpet blast was loudly raised. Now, so here we have a reference in the Quran, a prophetic reference. There are actually many mentions of the trumpet being blown, or a horn, or a bugle. This is one of them, Quran 50:20. And then the trumpet was blown. This is the day of the promised chastisement. So the trumpet signifies a kind of change and an announcement. And then also this alludes to biblical references and prophecies. For example, in Matthew chapter 24, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Okay, so there are, again, biblical references about trumpets announcing a great change. Shoghi Effendi states, she was the trumpet. Okay, so as Tahirih did this very dramatic announcement that distinguished the new revelation of the Baha'i religion and the beginning of the Baha'i era, so Paul had some very significant activities that distinguished Christianity from Judaism. So first, let's look at some dates. The declaration of Christ was about 27 AD. The crucifixion about 31 AD. Paul's ministry went from 34 to 64 AD. So this was after the crucifixion. And all of his mission took place in the vicinity of present-day Israel and the surrounding Mediterranean countries in what was then the Roman Empire. Now, at that time, there were many sects of Judaism, and one was the Pharisees, there were the Sadducees, there were the Zealots, there were the Essenes, and at the time of Paul, there was the Jesus movement. So, like the Bahá'í Faith was originally understood to be a movement within Islam, the beginnings of Christ's dispensation was thought to be a movement within Judaism. And these early followers of Christ, well, today modern scholars refer to them as Jewish Christians. Of course, at the time, that term was not used, but I'm going to use that term in this presentation. So the Jesus movement, or the Jewish Christians, were a sect, understood to be a sect of Judaism at the time of Paul. These Jewish Christians believed in Jesus Christ as the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. They believed that the teachings of Christ confirmed Judaism and all of the Jewish laws. And they followed the traditional rites and ceremonies of purification in Jewish law. Now, in enter the Gentiles. The word Gentile comes from the Latin gentilis, meaning clan or tribe. And the meaning is non-Israelite, non-Jewish, Greek, Roman, or any nationality that's not Jewish. In the New Testament, Gentiles are often referred to as heathens or sometimes nations. Okay, so the Jews had been a minority religion for several hundred years in this area, and they were surrounded by Gentiles. there were Gentiles who were attracted to the teachings of Christ. And scholars today call them Gentile Christians. They were different from the Jewish Christians in that they did not necessarily follow the Jewish laws. They weren't Jewish. The Jewish Christians followed the Jewish dietary laws. They kept the Sabbath and rites of purification, including circumcision. The Gentile Christians did not follow dietary laws. They did not observe the Sabbath, and they were not circumcised. The Greeks and Romans thought of circumcision as a mutilation. So there were some big differences. The early followers of Christ, the Jewish Christians, were the great majority. The Jewish Christians did not necessarily approve of the Gentile Christians. And there was a strong drive to impose the Jewish rituals and ceremonial laws on the Gentile Christians. Shoghi Effendi states, how great was the obstinacy with which the Jewish converts among the early Christians adhered to the ceremonies of their ancestors, and how fervent their eagerness to impose them on the Gentiles. Okay, so here we have two groups, both considering themselves followers of the teachings of Jesus Christ, and yet we have some division. So the question was, must a Gentile who wants to join a community of followers of Christ first become a Jew? And of particular interest was the question of male circumcision. Now, the traditional understanding, and this is a quote from the book of Acts in the New Testament, was unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Well, this was not a very good marketing strategy for the Gentiles to be encouraged to join the Christian movement, because that kind of surgery on an adult male was rough. Okay, so now Paul's understanding was that the followers of Christ were to be ministers of a new covenant. Christ, the Messiah, brought a new covenant. Salvation came by spiritual transformation through the love of Christ. And Paul states in one of his letters, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but a new creation is everything. Okay, so Paul clearly believes that it is not necessary to do this major Jewish rite of purification and argues against it. And the book of Acts says, Paul had no small dissension and debate with them meaning the Jewish Christians, which included Paul, the Apostle Paul. There was a meeting in Jerusalem. This is described in the book of Acts. And the outcome was that it was decided that circumcision would not be required of the Gentile Christians, of course, the male Gentile Christians. And a few Mosaic laws would be obligatory, but not all 603. There would be 3 dietary laws that would be obligatory, and the prohibitions against sexual immorality and idolatry. The Jewish Christians would continue with their traditional observance of Jewish law. Paul would assume the leadership of the Gentile Christians, and that should say Peter. Peter would assume the leadership of the Jewish Christians. Okay, so Paul states this in his epistle to the Galatians. He says, I have been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. But the matter was far from settled because there was really no complete agreement to these terms. and the community was very divided. So in this image, you can imagine that the inner white circle is all the Jewish Christians, and the Gentile Christians were just sort of hangers-on that weren't really seen as a part of the community. So we had these a very conservative wing on one side with traditional observances, the Gentile Christian wing on the other. They were seen as ritually unclean. There was a tone of Gentile subordination, and the two groups could associate somewhat, but they couldn't eat together. They couldn't marry, and for some couldn't even enter each other's homes because of this issue of ritual purification. This was problematic. Paul continued to argue that this was a new covenant. He says, in Christ Jesus, you are all children of one God through faith. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Okay, so eventually, Paul, on his own authority, abrogated the 3 dietary laws that had been made obligatory for Gentile Christians. He traveled through the Roman Empire, cultivating Christian communities open to all and encouraging lovers of Christ to work together in unity. Okay, so he really brought the difference. Now, the outcome was that the Jewish Christian sect declined and the Gentile Christian movement increased. Abdu'l-Baha states, observe how numerous were the diverse nations, races, clans, and tribes who, after the advent of Christ, gathered through the power of the love of God under the shadow of his word. Okay, so the invitation to follow Christ that Paul traveled and wrote about in all of his efforts, it paid off. And the Gentile Christian movement really became very strongly established and became the larger movement with the followers of Christ. So now, Paul's influence in this is very well recognized. Some scholarship here, Paul championed Christ's teachings as independent from the laws, institutions, traditions, and nationalistic ambitions of Judaism. This is just one example. Paul is very well recognized for bringing this understanding of the separation of one revelation from the old. So like Tahirih, Paul is recognized for singular initiatives that contributed significantly to distinguishing the new revelation from the old. For Tahirih, it really came to an event, a shocking event to catch people's attention, the removal of her veil, the announcement of a new advent. For Paul, it was years and years of working and teaching, but the same outcome was brought about. Okay, so now we're going to look at a second parallel. Both Tahirih and Paul had mystical visions of the manifestation of God prior to their acceptance of the new revelation. So with Tahirih, Tahirih was a devout Muslim who independently investigated the teachings of Sheikh Ahmad Yasai and Sayyid Kazim Irashti. And these were very important teachers pointing people in the direction of the coming of a new manifestation of God. And she followed Sayyid Kazim's instructions to, quote, seek out her Lord. During a period of prayer, meditation, and fasting, she had a vision of the Bab in a dream. Now remember, she'd never seen him. She had a vision. And this description by Abdu'l-Baha, a Sayyid wearing a black cloak and a green turban appeared to her in the heavens. He was standing in the air, reciting verses. Whenever she awoke, she wrote down one of the verses. Later, upon reading the Bab's commentary on the Suri of Joseph, she recognized the verses she had written down. Instantly offering thanks, she fell to her knees, bowed her forehead to the ground, convinced that the Bab's message was the truth. Okay, and with some communications, the Bab declared her one of the 18 letters of the living. Now, with Paul, it happened very differently. Paul was an early persecutor of the followers of Christ. He was a devout Jew, a member of the Pharisees, perhaps the strictest sect of Judaism. Paul believed that the Jesus movement was a dangerously heretical sect, and he participated in the persecution of the followers of Jesus Christ with full intent to end it. But some years after the crucifixion of Christ, Paul had a vision of the risen Christ. This is the road to Damascus story in the book of Acts. The vision was so strong that it knocked him off his horse and blinded him for 3 days. That's according to the story. Now, whether that he was figuratively knocked off his horse or whether he really was knocked off his horse, I don't know that we'll ever know. But from a persecutor of the Jesus movement, Paul became a persecuted follower of Christ. And he believed himself to be commissioned by God as an apostle of Christ. Now, it's interesting that the apostles chosen by Christ during his lifetime were these 12. And Paul is not numbered among them. He was an enemy of the faith at that time. And so for Paul to claim the status of apostleship is very, very bold and dramatic, but that is his claim. And this seems to be, his insight seems to be confirmed by Abdu'l-Bahá, who states, physical nearness or remoteness to the manifestation of God is of no importance. The essential fact is the spiritual affinity and ideal nearness. Judas Iscariot was for a long time favored in the holy court of His Holiness Christ, yet he was entirely far and remote, while Paul, the apostle, was in close embrace with His Holiness. So here I just think it's beautiful that Abdu'l-Bahá confirms Paul's apostleship. For Baha'is, there's no question. Okay. So in Tahirih's mystical vision, it's interesting that it confirmed the spiritual path that she was investigating. She was already seeking and praying and fasting and searching. But Paul's vision resulted in a radical reorientation of his beliefs. But both visions resulted in disciples who would carry out singular roles in proclaiming the distinctiveness of the new revelation. Now, looking at a third parallel, Tahirih and Paul were both brilliant writers and speakers. Shoghi Effendi states that through her eloquent pleadings, her fearless denunciations, her dissertations, poems, and translations, her commentaries and correspondence, she persisted in firing the imagination, enlisting the allegiance of Arabs and Persians alike to the new revelation. Now, I believe that Tahirih was fluent in Farsi and Arabic and also Turkish. She's very well known as a poetess, but did you know that she wrote commentaries, dissertations, that she did translations? Tahirih was very well educated. She had gone to school, her mother's school, and she was very, very capable writer. Abdu'l-Bahá states she put forth convincing arguments. So religious authorities became alarmed at her teachings of this new revelation, and they lodged complaints. Tahirih faced their attacks head on with her written word and her spoken word. She was not to be intimidated. She presented her offenders with unanswerable proofs, And when one or another appeared before her, she offered him, Abdu'l-Baha says, convincing arguments. So she was very capable at debate and at proving her points. Now, Paul, as well, was a brilliant writer and speaker. The scholar Christian Becker refers to him as a literary genius, a conveyor of eternal verities, and one of the most influential figures in the West. I believe all Christian scholars would agree with that. Paul made traveling trips throughout the Roman Empire, and so he was very good with connecting with people and appealing to people. And when he couldn't get there in person, he wrote letters, and many of which are we have today. They're part of the New Testament, and they actually testify to his brilliance in writing. So the book of Acts presents Paul as a great speaker who addressed people in homes, on the street, and in synagogues to great effect. So, so they were both writers and speakers, very effective. Another parallel is that over time, the influence of both Tahirih and Paul became international in scope. And of course, this is because they were brilliant writers and speakers. So, despite Tahirih's restricted travel, she was a woman. This was the middle of the 1800s in Persia. Women did not have the freedom to travel as men did. But despite this and her short ministry, and the fact that almost all of her writings were destroyed upon her martyrdom, her fame traveled outside of the Persian Empire. And we can attribute this, perhaps, largely to the time. In the 19th century, there was tremendous Western interest in Orientalism. There were new forms of communication and technologies for communicating. And there was international journalism. So many of these journalists interested in Orientalism wrote about Tahirih and shared her poetry. This from Martha Root, who is a world traveler. The fame of this immortal woman was noised abroad, and traveling with remarkable swiftness as far as the capitals of Western Europe aroused the enthusiastic admiration and evoked the ardent praise of men and women of diverse nationalities, callings, and cultures. She says, I have seen the influence of Tahirih in all the 5 continents I had visited. Okay, so here we have a surprising spread of Tahirih's poetry and news of her life throughout the world. Now, Paul, this is a very easy argument. His letters are in the most published book in the world, the Christian Bible. And so it certainly has international effect and is known as having tremendous effect on Western civilization. Now, another parallel I'd like to propose is that Tahirih and Paul stayed steadfast despite persecution from without the religion and vilification from within the religion. I think this is an interesting point. Persecution was a tragic reality in the apostolic age of both the Bahá'í Faith and Christianity. And this was something that Tahirih and Paul endured with all of the early believers of both religions. But being vilified by many of one's co-religionists is something that sets Tahirih and Paul apart. Tahirih, this is from Shoghi Effendi, the trumpeter was a lone woman, the noblest of her sex in that dispensation, whom even some of her co-religionists pronounced a heretic. So things aren't hard enough. You have assault from outside the religion, but inside, now we have accusations of being a heretic. Tahirih's outspoken teaching activities so alarmed her more rigid fellow believers that they accused her of immorality. And what was the response? This from the Dawnbreakers. The Bab, to whom these complaints had been addressed, replied in the following terms: "What am I to say regarding her whom the tongue of power and glory," meaning Baha'u'llah, "has named Tahirih, the pure one?" So the Bab defends Tahirih as the pure one. Paul was also vilified from within. Paul's doctrine of a new covenant with God through Christ conflicted with certain Jewish Christians who infiltrated Gentile Christian communities, causing confusion, dissension, and undermining Paul's authority. So Alan Siegel, a Christian scholar, states almost no Pauline letter forgets to mention Paul's status as an apostle through God, underlying his constant need to establish his credentials. Okay, so he was doubted, and certain Jewish Christians would instill doubt into the community about his Jewish law-free community instructions. So Paul himself claims that he faced dangers from bandits, from my own people, from Gentiles, and from false brothers and sisters. So in St. Paul's own time, Abdu'l-Baha states, no one duly recognized him. Nay, rather, he spent his days amidst difficulties and contempt. Like Tahirih, Paul stayed steadfast despite vilification from within his own religion. Now, a sixth parallel to propose, both Tahirih and Paul made successful appeals to government authorities. I find this interesting. With Tahirih, she made an appeal to the governor of Karbila. The story is that Shams Duduha was arrested mistakenly because the soldiers thought that Shams was Tahirih. You know, when people are veiled, it's hard to know who is who. So Shams was arrested and was about to be interrogated roughly, and Tahirih informed the governor of this mistake, and Shams was released. So Tahirih got the result that she wanted. Next, also to the governor of Karbila, Tahirih requested to leave house arrest, where she'd been held with no confirmation from higher authorities, and to go to Baghdad. And that was permitted. And the third, the governor of Kermanshah, Tahirih informed the governor of an assault that happened as she traveled with a small group outside of Kermanshah, and she demanded justice. They had been attacked and abandoned, and you'll have to look at the history of that, but she did get justice. It was attended to. So interesting that in Abdu'l-Baha's description of Tahirih's story in Memorials of the Faithful, there are these three incidents where she appeals to government authorities and gets what she asked for. We also have three incidences with Paul. So Paul was arrested and wrongly arrested, and so he appealed to the magistrate at Philippi for an apology. He didn't just want to be released. He insisted on getting a government apology for his arrest, and it was forthcoming. Of course, there was also an earthquake involved in that, but you'll have to read the book of Acts. Okay, then the Roman Centurions. After Paul was arrested and to be flogged for causing a public scene with his teaching, so he inquired of the soldiers as to the legality of flogging a Roman citizen without a trial. So he's inquiring, pointing out his rights. And the centurions stopped. They did not proceed. And he was taken to Governor Festus and imprisoned in Caesarea. But he was there for some time with no trial decision. And so he appealed to the governor to be tried before the emperor in Rome. The governor allowed that to occur, which put Paul in Rome, where he actually had a good bit of freedom to teach the faith in that big city. So it's interesting, in Book of Acts, Paul appeals 3 times to the government, and in Abdu'l-Bahá's story of Tahirih, she appeals 3 times to the government. Little coincidence there. Okay, then we have another one, a 7th parallel. In the history of both faiths, there are stories of coordinated efforts by Tahirih's and Paul's co-religionists to rescue them from certain death early in their ministries. Let's see what happens with Tahirih. So in 1847, Tahirih was under house arrest in Qazvin, Persia, and influential men were demanding her death. By Baha'u'llah's direction, Tahirih left the house that night in the company of a fellow believer, met another with horses outside of the city gates, and rode with her rescuers to Baha'u'llah's house in Tehran, Baha'u'llah's family house. So she was rescued. Abdu'l-Bahá said they managed by a stratagem to free her from that embroilment and got her to Tehran in the night. So Tahirih went and continued to teach the faith of the Bab for another 5 years. Now, Paul was rescued from Damascus. When he was teaching in that city, his co-religionists learned that the governor of Damascus intended to have him killed, and that officials were watching the city gates day and night in order to capture him. To rescue Paul from certain death, his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket, perhaps maybe a laundry type basket. So Paul was saved. He got out of Damascus, and this was early in his 30-year ministry. So he went on to teach for years after that. 2 stories of their co-religionists rescuing them. Another parallel. Neither Tahirih nor Paul met the manifestation of God in person. Tahirih communicated with the Bab in writing, but never met him face to face. Paul became a follower of Christ about 3 years after the crucifixion, and there is no record of Paul ever meeting Christ before the crucifixion. Now, he had a vision of the risen Christ, and indeed Tahirih had a vision of the Bab, but they never met in a physicality person. And another parallel. Both Tahirih's and Paul's initiatives promoted social change, including gender equity. Now, with Tahirih, this is an easy story. This is something that she is known for, being a champion of gender equity. Tahirih challenged and stepped beyond traditional barriers to women. You find this all through her life story. And her very last words, right before her martyrdom, were, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." Shoghi Effendi refers to Tahirih as the first woman suffrage martyr. Now, Paul and gender equity, this is a little more difficult situation because Paul has not always been associated with gender equity due to verses in Pauline epistles that appear to support the subordination of women, such as, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." Okay, there's other like verses. Okay, but biblical scholarship indicates that such verses conflict with Paul's egalitarian teachings as found in his authenticated epistles. So questions of authenticity of these verses arise. Let's look at this chart. There are 13 Pauline epistles, meaning 13 epistles that bear Paul's name. 7 of these New Testament scholars have authenticated, meaning that through literary analysis, historical analysis, through all this analyses, these letters appear to be written mostly, completely by Paul. These 6 letters on the right side of the screen, they are written in Paul's name, but scholars believe they were written a generation or two after his death. Now, this was actually not an unusual thing at that time for people to write in the name of a great teacher. And so, they bear the name of Paul, but for various reasons that you would need to research on your own, because I'm not going to go into all that here, there are alerts in these books that show that they are inconsistent with Paul's theology as stated in the authenticated letters, and they use language that Paul would not use and other things like that. Now, it's in Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Timothy that the verses, most of the verses having to do with the subjugation of women are found. So it's very likely that Paul didn't write that at all. Paul taught radical change in his authenticated epistles. He states, "There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus." Paul challenged traditional gender roles, and he backed this up in his actions. For example, Paul encouraged women to serve in positions of leadership. He refers to Priscilla as a fellow worker in Christ. He refers to Euodia and Syntyche as fellow workers whose names are recorded in the book of life. He refers to Phoebe. He refers to Phoebe in her station as a deacon, which is a strong position of leadership. And he refers to Junia as an apostle of Christ. How high can you get? So Paul's authenticated epistles abound, really, with appreciation of women's leadership in the early Jesus movement community. Also, Paul taught mutual gender respect and responsibility. He states, "In the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband." So we have this dependence and interdependence. Paul's teachings were radical in the Hellenistic world, where women were considered property in marriage. To say that a man was not independent of a woman was a radical statement. In modern New Testament scholarship, Paul is noted as being progressive for his time in the area of gender equity. So, as far as the subjugation of women in the non-authenticated letters and the interpolated verses, that being a verse or two that scholars believe were written into his authenticated letters, Okay, the belief is that this is sad evidence of how quickly the church retreated from Paul's more egalitarian practice after his martyrdom, that this was imposed on his writing. Okay, so this is actually a massive topic, and if it interests you, there are many, many new books in this sort of new Paul area of study, and these are good authors. Okay, and the 10th and the last one we'll look at, both Tahirih and Paul were martyred at a time of wholesale massacre of early believers in their respective religions. Now, Tahirih during mass persecution of Babis in 1852, Tahirih was sentenced to death, taken to a garden, strangled with her own scarf, and her body thrown down a well. In the Dawnbreakers, the site of her martyrdom is identified as the Garden of Ilkhani, outside of the city gates of Tehran. And this is a photo of that garden. Now, historical accounts indicate that Paul was beheaded in Rome during the slaughter of Christians ordered by Emperor Nero following the burning of Rome. Historians believe that it's likely that Nero actually started that fire, or when he was accused of starting the fire, he put the blame on the Christians, and then there was untold slaughter. And they believe that it was at that time that Paul was beheaded. Okay, so just to review some of these parallels, both Tahirih and Paul were responsible for singular initiatives in distinguishing a new revelation from old revelation. They both had mystical visions of the manifestation of God prior to their alliance with the new religion. They were both brilliant speakers and writers. Their teachings had international effects. They were both vilified by their co-religionists. They made successful appeals to government. They were rescued by small bands of co-religionists early in their ministries. They never met the manifestation of God in physical person. They promoted social change, including gender equity, and they were martyred in the heroic ages of their respective religions. So you might think, so what? Well, I came upon this very interesting teaching of the Bab in his commentary on the spiritual station of the letters of the living. The Bab states that they are the return of the spiritual qualities of the holy souls of each dispensation before them. That is, the early believers of the present dispensation are the return of the earliest believers of the last, spiritual return of the early believers of the last dispensation. This is a quote from the Persian Bayan. They are the lights which in the past have eternally prostrated themselves and will prostrate themselves eternally in the future before the celestial throne. In each dispensation, they, and remember the context is that he's speaking of the letters of the living, they are called by different names among the people. And in each revelation, their individual names are also changed. Yet the names of their inmost realities, which refer unto God, are manifest in their hearts. So, very interesting that the letters of the living in each dispensation, they're called by different names, and yet they have the same spiritual qualities. So the parallels in the ministries of Tahirih and Paul paint a picture of a type of early apostle who bears much of the burden of distinguishing the new revelation from the old, a pure channel with the capacity to envision a new kind of community, a person of action at once valued by and threatening to her or his co-religionists, and really a kind of maverick in the new religious order. Tahirih's ministry is evidence that spiritual qualities and capacities of service know no gender restrictions. At the time in the Christian dispensation, Paul carried out this function as the one who really drove home the idea of a new revelation. In the beginning of the Baha'i era, the same role fell to a woman. Shoghi Effendi said she announced the advent of the new era. Okay, so, and a final word to reflect on this point that the beloved figures in one's religious history are, in a spiritual sense, the return of the beloved figures of other religious traditions could be a helpful step toward unity. Because of their affinity in mission and circumstances and spiritual qualities, to love and revere Tahirih is, in a sense, to love and revere Mullah Hussein. No, to love and revere Paul. In the same sense, to love and revere, let me start that over. To reflect on this point, that the beloved figures in one's religious history are, in a spiritual sense, the return of the beloved figures of other religious traditions, could be a helpful step toward unity. Because of their affinity in mission, circumstances, and spiritual qualities, to love and revere Tahirih is, in a sense, to love and revere the Apostle Paul. In the same sense, to love and revere Mullah Hussein, Qudus, Fahid, and all the letters of the living is to love and revere Peter, Philip, James, and all of the apostles of Christ. So I'm proposing this as a way to, for interfaith dialogue, and also as a way to really appreciate the giant figures in other people's religions. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you so much, JoAnn.
You're welcome.
Now we're going to open it up to questions.
Okay.
I don't see any questions yet. I'm not sure if there are any questions on Facebook. Boyd is looking out for those, but that was really interesting. I'd heard some of this talk before. I think you may have added in something since you did it before, but it was really, really a lot of research that went into that.
Yeah. So what was it that caught your attention?
Well, the first part caught my attention because I hadn't thought of that Jesus movement of the Jewish Christians and the Gentiles as being similar to the Babis and the Baha'is. I never thought of it that way, but it is an interesting parallel there.
Yes, very much so. That at the beginning of the revelation, people think it's, this is an adjustment,
right,
of old religion, and so we have to, work past that.
So we're ready to take questions now. If you need help finding the chat box, raise your hand. Let's see what we have here. Nothing yet. I mean, I think that your presentation was so interesting that there should be some comments, but I'm not seeing any yet. Questions. Okay. Here's one. Let's just open up this chat box. Sandra says, I have been profoundly moved by this presentation. I especially appreciate the clarification of Paul's view of women. Thank you so much. That's a comment. Okay.
Well, you're very welcome. And Paul's view of women is a hugely misunderstood, and really it's become tragic because Paul's non-authenticated epistles are often what people point to for the subjugation of women in the church, and that's been the case historically. And I think the problem is that people don't read Christian scholarship, because if they did, they would understand the tremendous information that's come out about the authentic versus non-authentic epistles, and the really radical teachings that Paul brought in terms of gender equity. Yes.
And Lisa says, what inspired you to first look at this topic?
Yes, well, I can thank the friends at the Irfan Colloquium, Dr. Ayman and Dr. Ayman. And a few years ago, it was the 100th year anniversary of the writing of Memorials of the Faithful.
Okay.
So, Memorials of the Faithful is a book where Abdu'l-Baha explores the lives of, I guess, 69 early believers.
Wow.
In the Baha'i era. Yeah. And most of them are people that you wouldn't hear of because they didn't play a big part, a dramatic role in the faith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, so the Irfan Colloquium was going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Abdu'l-Baha's writing, and I was invited to present a paper. And I objected. I said, well, I'm the Baha'i Bible person, and I don't think that I'm going to find anything in here, Baha'i Bible, to write. and so Roya Ayman suggested, well, maybe some comparison of the early believers of Christianity to the early believers of the Baha'i Faith. Yeah. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a go. So I read Memorials of the Faithful through several times, and then read the book of Acts, which really is about the early believers and what they did in the Bible. So I read through that several times, and Tahirih and Paul just stuck out. And I thought, there's no way I can do this, because Paul is a giant figure in Christianity, and Tahirih is a giant figure in the Baha'i Faith. I thought this is too big, but I did it anyway, and I'm glad I did, because it was a wonderful, wonderful study. And then I got to learn about the new scholarship on Paul, which indicates him actually quite a bit. Because at first I thought, well, Tahirih is a champion of women's rights and the equality of women and men. How can I possibly, make a parallel with Paul, who's known for the exact opposite? So I really did have to do a great deal of research before I was able to find out what the current understanding of Paul's radical teachings on gender equity were.
Speaking of that, Lena said, I have another comment here, and it feeds into what you were saying, because Lena says, thank you for reconciling me to Paul. And then she says, are you using the term equity as synonymous with equality? I guess she means equity as in equity between women and men.
I would have to look at, I don't know if I know the detail definitions of those two terms and how they might be different. So I'm gender equity as in women and men have always been equal in the sight of God, and should have the same opportunities and be given the same resources to find their purpose in life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Lena, if you want to rephrase that, we will look at the question again. I missed a question from James. Sorry, James. James says, hi, JoAnn. Is there such a comparison that you know of between the dispensations of Christianity and Islam? And this is from Jim, your limo, he says.
Yes. I don't know of any. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. And I think it would be a very interesting study.
Right. Oh, your limo driver to and from MCBI. I've met Jim too. He has also driven me. All right.
Thank you, Jim, for that question. I think that Jim should do that research study, actually.
All right, I think there's another one here from Shala. Shala says, in the Kitab Igan, explaining the matter of return, Baha'u'llah also explains that the believers in the new faith are the return of the previous believers. The deniers are also the return of the previous deniers. So that's a comment, I suppose. She's saying that the deniers of the previous faiths are also identified as returning to deny the religion.
It's the return of those spiritual qualities. Right. Yes. Yeah. So it's really fascinating, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Here's another one from Persia. Persia says, thank you ever so much for your insights. I learned a lot of useful information and most appreciate how you see this as a possible way to useful dialogue amongst various religions. I'm sure there must be similar and other parallels between various Baha'i and Baha'i subjects and characters with those of all the great faiths.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. You know, it's about I think it's about our heart and how we're perceiving something. So if I see my Christian family members or friends as honoring the apostles, and that spiritual return of the apostles is in the letters of the living, I feel an affinity there. You know, it's and it's a heart affinity. Mm-hmm. People know what's in the heart, so I just think that it helps bring what could be seen as two different groups together.
Mm-hmm. And Shala continues with another comment. With Paul being a giant figure in Christianity, is it possible that they added letters, that's letters in the Bible, in his name, which deny gender equity to prove the lower station of women?
Yes, that's actually one of the motivations that is suggested by the Christian scholarship, that the patriarchal culture of the time really couldn't tolerate the radical teachings of Paul and Christ in the way of gender equity, and that these were, they call them interpolations, verses put into to kind of clarify, maybe just a verse or two, but to clarify that, not to clarify, but to minimize the equity factor.
Mm-hmm. And Lena
you might enjoy reading the literature on, it's called the New Paul Studies.
The New Paul. And we will have these slides available on the website very soon, certainly by tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to look at them and look at the books that JoAnn has recommended. Lena, who had asked about equity and equality, says, my understanding is that equity implies same opportunities, but does not imply equality. From your answer, it sounds like you actually mean that both Paul and Tahirih championed gender equality, not gender equity, but gender equality.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think that's it for the questions.
All right.
So unless there's any more popping up in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to say thank you to everybody. And I'm going to just let you know the next web talk is going to be on Sunday, May 5 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 11 a.m. Pacific and 8 p.m. Western European Time. And this is one of our bicentenary web talks. It's called Sheikh Tabarsi, a Turning Point in the Bahá'í Faith. And Dr. Siamak Zabihi Moghadam is the presenter. He has a PhD in Middle Eastern history from the University of Haifa and has been visiting faculty at Western Washington University and Bennington College. And he will be talking and telling us about Sheikh Tabarsi, a turning point in the Baha'i faith. So we look forward to welcoming you then. Thank you again so much, JoAnn.
Thank you, Nikki. Always a pleasure.
All right, so tell your friends to watch this. It will be online, again, within 24 to 48 hours on our website, wilmetinstitute.org. So long.